Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the special business meeting for the District of Squamish on Tuesday, March 3rd. Hatsqualin, Queesluktumuk, Squamish, Oweameo. We, as always, are meeting on the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation. Motion to adopt our agenda, please. Moved by Councillor French, seconded by Councillor Herford. All those in favor, opposed, motion carries. All right. Exciting item up first on our agenda, which is the Loggers East neighborhood plan. And I'll turn it over to Seth.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Jan Solonishkis. With me today is Susan Stratus, who is the planner who is working on this project, as well as Dave Merrow, who's the Director of Major Projects, who's involved on the engineering side, and we have a few staff people here as well. If there's questions on environment or stormwater management, and I'll pass it over to Susan.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'll just jump right into this. The first slide, ignore the date, the year. Got that wrong.
Really jumped ahead.
It is a long-range plan, but not quite that long. I just wanted to describe the plan area here, which runs from, it's on the east side of Loggers Lane, runs from Raven Drive, encompasses Finch Drive down to Robin Drive at the south. And the area extends to the east beyond the end of the current paved roads into some large properties that move up the hillside. So the purpose today is to update Council on the public engagement we've had so far and some of the technical reports that have been done, and to obtain feedback on the preliminary land use options. So just looking at this plan area, originally the Loggers East neighborhood in the OCP was defined as a much bigger area. It included Ravens Crest area to the north, running up as far as Centennial Way. But because that area has now been developed, the actual sub-area plan area is much smaller and is shown there. And this map actually is quite handy because the red stripes on the outside edge of this area indicates the land that is outside the urban containment boundary. So this area is fairly important as an infill area, and once you get further east, you get into lands that are intended for much further in the future. So the OCP describes what a sub-area plan is to include, which is a detailed land use plan including industrial, residential, agricultural, with consideration for the neighboring land uses, density targets and housing mix, inventory of natural hazards and response strategies, inventory of ESAs, identifying significant contiguous areas for protection, opportunities for protection of trail corridors, parks and trails, areas to be used for employment, agricultural opportunities, food, rural uses, connectivity, watershed hydrology and stormwater strategies, heritage assets, and climate change resiliency. So it's quite the list of topics that you need to look at for what is actually a fairly small neighborhood. But I guess our intent here with the sub-area plan is to come up with a fairly focused and refined set of policies that touch on each of these issues. So again, looking at the OCP, you can see the plan area in context. To the south, there are industrial business lands, future residential long-term to the east and south, which is primarily land owned by the Squamish Nation. And to the north, intensive industrial, covers quite a large area, parks, greenway, and recreation, which is the Nordic, the Nordic site there. And some additional residential areas to the north and the east. And further west, we've got the Brennan Park Recreation Center and a large parks, greenway, and recreation designation, and conservation and ecological reserve further west that represents the important habitat areas there. So it's quite a mixed area. The current zoning is similar. Within the plan area, what we're calling the lowlands is mostly zoned RL1, and those are primarily 2-acre lots used for residential purposes. The RS1, which is goes up the hillside, is also zoned for residential use, but has not been developed to any extent yet. There are rural uses throughout the neighborhood, including horse boarding, riding stables, and kennels, so there is some degree of rural use going on. Throughout the neighborhood, there are quite a few home businesses of all types, and some industrial storage taking place that is not actually permitted under the zoning, but kind of a historical use, and a number of vacant properties. So looking at the road network, this is another aspect we're looking at. Finch Drive is designated in the OCP as a potential major route that might connect in the long term, possibly down to Valley Cliff. We don't know. That will depend on the Squamish Nation lands and the development plans there. So in this plan, we are not looking at a future road connection. That is kind of outside the scope of the plan, but we are planning that Finch Drive will become an arterial, whereas right now it's a two-lane rural road, so it will need to be upgraded over time. The area is in a flood hazard area, although the probability of river flooding here is low compared to other areas such as downtown or Brackendale. And the coastal flood hazard is also considered low, although with sea level rise it may exacerbate existing drainage issues. So the amount of fill or raising of properties here that's needed is much less than other parts of the community. With drainage, there's well-known historical drainage problems here. You know, the river used to basically run through here, and so it's low-lying with groundwater drainage issues, high water table. The area drains via Loggers Creek into Wilson Slough, goes through culverts under Loggers Lane and into the upper Macomb Blind Channel. Many of those ditches are interconnected with the stream system, and they do have high habitat values, so that's something else we're aware of as we're going through this project. There has been recently council approved an integrated stormwater management plan to review the broader drainage issues, looking at natural assets valuation and potential drainage solutions. And this area is going to be the first area modeled to see what potential drainage solutions might be and costs associated with that. So that is going on concurrently with our planning project. There are other constraints in this neighborhood. One of the ones I've highlighted in yellow, running north-south, is the BC Hydro Corridor, which really does affect a number of the properties through the area. And the Fortis corridor also runs through here and moves along Finch Drive. Now, in terms of that being a constraint, it is an existing line that is there, and Fortis is indicated that they are planning to twin that, although I understand they are looking at other alternatives. The pink area is not a no-go area. It's just how the district mapping highlights that Fortis corridor, and it's actually indicating the area where you need to call before you dig, but it's not a setback area. So moving on to the environmental review, we did have Cascade Environmental do a review of this neighborhood, and this clean map just shows the existing stream system with Finch Creek. So if I can still get this working there. Yeah. Finch Creek is the main creek corridor running through here, and again interconnected with those drainage courses along the ditches, and a number of smaller streams in the eastern area that again connect through into this stream system. The Cascade report looked more closely at the environmental conditions, and most of the environmentally sensitive areas are connected with the Finch Creek, Loggers Lane Creek stream system, and those are shown in red on this drawing. And there are also other sensitive ecosystems associated with high-value riparian and wetland habitat, red-listed ecological communities, which are mainly the forested areas. And there are an abundance of other EVRs such as coarse woody debris, wildlife trees, wildlife corridors, and rock outcrops that support a whole range of mammals and amphibians that are noted. So what this map is indicating to us is the red areas are generally the no-go areas. The green area through here is a bench that's more developable, and the yellow areas are areas where they need to be developed with care to try and protect all of the identified environmental resources there. So the map 3 of the report kind of reinforces that and provides us with a lot of recommendations in the report about which areas are to be protected and which areas are required to develop with sensitive design, which are the areas kind of shown in yellow. So when we take this closer look at the habitat areas, you can see that this neighborhood is quite heavily fractured. I guess by the time we look at the habitat areas combined with the BC Hydro Corridor in particular, it really does place some limitations on this neighborhood. The second technical report we've had done is a steep slope analysis by SFA Engineering. And this was predicated on, you've got existing OCP policies that say no single-family development where slopes exceed 25%, possible multifamily development up to 40% slopes, and no development over 40%. So we asked this engineering company to take a closer look at this neighborhood and just see what the slopes are. We have only very generalized mapping in the OCP. So this map in yellow shows the areas 25 to 40%, and in red shows the areas over 40%. And one of the things that came out of this mapping, I guess, is the fact that you've got this fairly open bench land here that is readily developed, and you've got some pockets that are possibly developable both in the yellow and the white color. But the challenge is getting roads both up to these areas along any of the existing road corridors, and then once you're in these properties, moving through them to connect the road systems to serve any new housing is definitely tricky. And the recommendations from the report are shown on this map, and in the cross-hatched pink, which doesn't show too well, are the areas not recommended for development, and they include some setback areas where there are noted areas of potential rockfall. So these maps, I should note, both with the environmental maps and the slope maps, are still, they're a closer look at things than anything else we've gone, but they're also a broad-based review of these lands. When people come in with individual development applications, they will be hiring their own environmental consultant and their own geotechnical engineer to take an on-site look at the properties, and there certainly may be some variations when those reports are done.
So, clarity question?
Yeah, just, it was counterintuitive to me, the idea that multifamily on steep slopes is okay and single family is not. I would kind of expect the reverse. Can you explain a little bit of why that would be?
Yeah, I think the main principle there would just be the smaller footprint. You know, you can house a lot more people, and it's easier. You can house a lot more people in a small footprint, and the buildings can be stepped down the slope more readily than they can for a single family that kind of really uses up a lot of land per person. So we have initiated a public input process. An open house was held in late October, and there was a very good response there. We had over 100 people at the open house, and we had a very good response to the online survey, over 100 responses. And the main issues that emerged from that process was really people looking to preserve the green space and wildlife corridors here, a lot of drainage concerns, and an overwhelming message to keep the area rural but to keep the neighborhood from changing. And that, of course, is a difficult message when we're in a sub-area plan process, because it typically is about change. a lot of recommendations to provide for equestrian uses, and I heard from a lot of people who actually don't live in the neighborhood. When I looked at the survey results, about 40%, sometimes 50% of the responses came from people who didn't live in the neighborhood. And I'd say a lot of those are adjacent neighbors, and others are equestrian users who want to keep that use established in the neighborhood. A lot of people mentioned they like the diversification of types of land uses here. A lot of concerns expressed about the future Fortis pipeline. There wasn't a lot of support for densification, and those who did suggested it should be closer to Loggers Lane. Concerned about traffic and not wanting an arterial road along
Through the neighborhood.
through the neighborhood. Yes. Eunice is here to fill me in with words. There was a desire to have sidewalks, trails, bike and equestrian paths. And again, a lot of those comments seem to come from people in the Ravens Crest neighborhood who mentioned that their neighborhood was lacking those things. And so they use this neighborhood as their kind of backyard, and they would like to make sure those types of pathways are included, as well as local parks and playgrounds. So just looking at a couple of the survey responses, we asked people what they liked about living in the neighborhood. Rural atmosphere, large lots was at the top, close to recreation facilities, close to downtown, and a great family neighborhood were certainly the big responses there. We asked people what type of future housing do they think is a good fit. Single-family homes was the first choice, and it's not surprising, kind of opening an exercise like this. Townhouses had some support, as did clustered homes and duplexes. Surprisingly, not many people ticked off rural and acreages, so I'm not quite sure. We're in a bit of a disconnect there with the written comments. Not much support for apartments at this stage. We also asked people what type of commercial uses they felt fit in the neighborhood. Home businesses were the clear winner. Rural uses, kennels and boarding. No support really for medium industrial, or not much for light industrial. There was some commercial and mixed uses, didn't receive a lot of support. And again, we weren't giving people too much information. It was just an outright question. And neighborhood commercial got some kind of modest responses. In the written text that people provided us, pretty much everybody wanted a local coffee shop and a corner store. But I don't know if those are going to develop. So moving on to the plan, I guess we've had kind of digested what we've heard from the public and those technical reports, and kind of worked internally at a staff level and come up with some early directions and guiding principles for this project. And I think the first one would be to make sure you're protecting your natural capital, which is probably going to be the most cost-effective way of protecting your minimizing stormwater impacts. And of course, you've got requirements to protect your streams and wetlands under the riparian area regulation, and also protecting forested areas and slopes would fit into that. Carbon neutrality, that's a council direction to minimize emissions with new development. I'm not quite sure what those policies are going to look like. That's something we have to work on. Employment lands and increasing job opportunities is something that's taken on more importance with council, and so that's something we've been looking at in this neighborhood as to how can we implement that here. Food production and agriculture, there is an agricultural plan that's been finished, and so we are suggesting an option that does promote that. Housing mix, looking for clustered units, a range of unit types, looking to improve connectivity and neighborhood amenities. So these are kind of the guiding principles that we'll elaborate on as the plan is developed. And I wanted to just kind of show you how we've been working with this land. When we take out the sensitive environmental areas, we've kind of ballparked how much developable land is in the neighborhood. And similarly, looking at the slope lands, taking out the areas that are over 40% slope. Again, looking at how much, and these are total ballpark numbers, how much of that land is developable. So we come up with two land use options, and option one is probably the most mixed. Starting from the east side, the sloped areas, there's not a lot of variation in these options because they're fairly limited what they can be used for. They're not really suitable for employment use. So there's around 50 acres there, and probably less than half of it is developable. So we're presuming this would be used for hillside clusters with mixed multifamily housing forms. And depending on that form, it would be 200 to 450 units, more or less, by the time you account for the environmental values. What we're considering to be the lowland areas are some of these 2-acre parcels, which are down in the lower portion. And this area is probably not as compromised as some of the other areas by streams. So you've got net 10 to 11 acres developable, which could give you 120 to 200 units. We've introduced an area for rural agriculture and food production up on Raven Drive, and this is in part because there is a fairly well-established equestrian use here, and some, I wouldn't call it farming, kind of, I guess, rural type crop growing. But this area is fairly compromised by the presence of the power line running through, and you've got the stream running through. So we are proposing that this stay in its 2-acre state and have a limited range of agricultural uses to keep part of that rural flavor in the neighborhood. Then moving on, kind of in the center of the neighborhood over to Loggers Lane, and Finch Drive runs through the middle of this. We've got a very large mixed employment kind of mud type area shown here, which has about 10 acres developable. Again, the power line and Finch Creek take quite a chunk out of this land. And it could provide about 10,000 square meters of employment space, upper story housing, 100 to 200 units there. And then at the bottom of the site, fronting Loggers Lane and fronting Robin Drive at the bottom, we're proposing this is light industrial, 9 to 10 acres net, and employment another 8 to 10,000 square meters. Now, the one thing I wanted to point out about commercial and industrial uses, they fit fairly well with this hydro corridor because that open area can be used for parking. The same with multifamily, although you can't build under the power line, you can use the open areas for parking or for storage of materials, like a building supply yard, for instance. Often they make use of those areas. So in total, option one, and it's a huge range at this point, 400 to 850 residential units, 18 to 20,000 square meters of mixed commercial type development. In option two, we've taken out the rural. I'm not sure if that's a realistic future for this neighborhood, so we have in option two taken that out. The sloped areas remain the same. The lowland areas are expanded into housing throughout. And we've got a much smaller mud area and a smaller light industrial area. We've pulled back on all of those things, and the focus here really is residential. I should just kind of recall that the existing OCP has this entire neighborhood designated as residential, so if we're going to introduce mud or light industrial, we'd have to use the sub-area plan to amend the current OCP designation. So this one has less mud, 5 to 6,000 square meters, and 5 to 1,100 units of housing. So with this project, the next steps are to, the stormwater management plan is going to take some time, but it is underway, and we're hoping to have the results from the modeling exercise to help us understand the best approach to this neighborhood, and that might influence those two options we put on paper. Based on what we hear from council today, we're tentatively looking at scheduling another open house toward the end of March, third week or so of March, to present land use options. And I'm kind of being a bit cautious about that because it may be, as we move forward, there's not too many options actually. And I don't want to go to the public with options on paper that are not realistic. You know, for instance, if there's really a direction that rural is not a realistic long-term land use, I don't really want to go to the public with that as an option if it's not a real option. So, you know, I'm just going to kind of play this by ear a bit based on the discussion this afternoon. But we're planning to ideally bring a draft plan to council for first reading sometime in April, and then go back to the public April, May for a third open house to present that plan and get feedback on it. Bringing the plan back to council in June for second reading, most likely a revised plan, and looking at public hearing sometime in the summer, and then late summer, potentially adoption of this sub-area plan.
Thank you. Okay, let's start here. Councillor Herford, Councillor French.
Thank you. The two options you presented, in option 2, I understand the reducing the mud zone. What was the rationale but in that scenario with removing the agricultural use as well?
What was the reason for removing?
Yeah, it just seemed like there was, of sort of all the pieces that we have to play with there, that I understand the mud piece being potentially smaller, but could that not occur with also maintaining the agricultural use?
Yes, it could, and these are kind of moving pieces. I guess it's a bit like a board game at this point. That certainly is an option. One of the reasons we took it off is we do understand there's a number of property owners on Raven who are interested in developing. So it was really just to give a clear distinction between these. But these are actually kind of movable parts. It could be, we might end up kind of mixing the pieces from the two options.
But they're not interrelated. Those two things aren't directly related.
No,
Okay.
no, it was really just to, unfortunately I don't have a slide that shows them in combination, but yes, that option, that rural could be combined with this one if that were council's direction.
If I may add, we try to present two very different options, but there could be 8 or 10 options here between the two of them. Our biggest concern with the rural is the risk that it, turns into rural estates, essentially. And so I think if we go in that direction, then limiting this house size, things like that, are very important to implement in the zoning bylaw.
And is there any there's no agricultural land reserve parcels here or anything like that?
No.
Councillor French.
In the report, there are a number of references to Raven's Crest. And I'm wondering, is that an error and it should be a reference to Raven's Woods?
Oh, yes.
It's probably it's the reference to the small lot single family that's on the northwest side.
Yeah, that's correct. Get that.
Thank you.
Councillor Stoner.
One of the things that we are asked to kind of consider in these two options and inclusion in the guiding principles is the employment lands component, which I'm going to guess is perhaps added in there as it's one of Council's core strategic plans. There's also some OCP alignment with it, but we are still awaiting the employment lands strategy results. Do we have any insight if that's going to indicate that it would be useful to have additional industrial land here?
Yes, so we have now received the first draft of the model, and we're requesting some changes with the consultant, so we're working still in fine-tuning it. But early results show that we have kind of a really healthy supply of retail space in Squamish, and a real deficiency in office space, and also a deficiency in light industrial. There certainly seems to be a high demand for retail space, and if we want to grow those other sectors, there is not a lot of supply. So early indications are that kind of what we expected to see, and this is an opportunity to gain some of that.
Yep.
My other question is around the environmentally sensitive areas mapping and how we're accounting for habitat connectivity through all of those pieces. So I appreciate that we've mapped out where they are sensitive ecosystems. What work are we doing in terms of what is the impact as we start to fragment those habitats?
The report contains quite a few recommendations on opportunities. We specifically asked them in the terms of reference to look at connectivity and wildlife corridors. And there are a number of recommendations in the report, and these would need to be implemented at any rezoning stage. But maybe Carolyn, did you want to add to that?
Certainly, through the mayor. And also for anyone tuning in online, I'm Caroline Ashikian, environmental coordinator with the district and a professional biologist. So the environmental consultant who had prepared the report did look at connectivity, and particularly for evidence of wildlife use, and has identified the area to the farthest east of the lands as a wildlife corridor.
Any other questions, Councillor Stover?
No, okay.
Councillor Anderson?
I appreciate that we're going to be going out to the public at least once more, to the neighborhood as well as the public in this process, considering how important our neighborhood planning initiative is, and this is number 2. We'll be moving to another area next year perhaps, or later this year. But I also see that because I think that there is a need to engage further with the neighborhood regarding these moving parts as you've described it to us. I'm aware that 4 of the property owners on Raven, whose property is tentatively sketched in under option 1 as rural small agriculture, are opposed to that suggestion. And they suggest that their properties are, after all, face few constraints for development. That is, there is one riparian area there, and that's not one of these 4 properties. And that they are people who are, one of the persons I've spoken to, families I've spoken to, is quite familiar with the equestrian neighborhood and has been a part of that neighborhood for a long time, but does not see a future for agriculture depending on how we define it. And this is really my point. I think we need to understand better and define better our use of these terms and our ideas about agriculture and food production. At any rate, I think it's a significant fact that a good majority of the area encompassed in that area is encompassed by property owners who are opposed to that designation. Yes. So I do suggest that we need to learn more from them, and also from their experience. As I mentioned, that they are people experienced with the local equestrian milieu in that neighborhood. Secondly, there is on page 1 of the report, and I believe in another spot as well, there's reference to industrial storage. Now, I can't speak to the zoning circumstances, and it's been suggested here in the report that this is not recognized in current zoning. We have a number of long-standing industries here, and I would not actually, although they may from the streetscape look to be storage, there's in fact manufacturing and what we would call shops and fleets, equipment fleets that are parked there. Low bid services, craneage, equipment repair and maintenance. And I'd like to highlight one of these properties. It's 1014 Fitch Drive, which is Squamish's oldest manufacturing company. It's steel fabricating, and they have a number of lines in what they do. Amphibian aircraft, lift systems, including some of the early lift systems at Whistler in the 1960s, were produced by this company. And interestingly, lift systems for developments on steep terrain is one of the specialties of this company. And so there's considerable irony that in option 2, that they would be, in effect, these functions would be displaced. So I'm concerned about that, especially because we don't really yet, we are expecting some reports coming down the pipe on our employment lands picture from our Economic Development Department with planning's participation, of course. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty there, and this will feed into the discussion as it evolves through this spring and summer concerning this area plan. I suggest it's important that we consider that information. Now, the other irony with respect to 1014 Finch Drive is that the proprietor of these manufacturing businesses has been a long-standing advocate of what we are now calling the mixed-use development or MUD zone. This person really is a champion of that use, and then, of course, naturally is favors our option one as we see it. So that I think both of these uses, industrial, light industrial, and agricultural, I think we need to do more work and gather more information, not least from our reviews, district-wide studies on our picture for employment lands. And this person, who unfortunately was not available for the public open house, would be very keen to discuss this and with reference to other jurisdictions, a mixed-use zone. So I'll leave it at that on those two issues. So there are more than storage. There's other activities going on there, and they are long-standing businesses, and we don't really have a lot of places where we can land those businesses today, especially if it's starting businesses and manufacturing in nature.
Do you have any questions, Councillor? We were just on questions, not comments necessarily, so I'm just wondering if you've got any questions at this point.
Well, actually, I do, but I also think that discussion is important at this phase.
We are going to have discussion.
Very good.
But I was just trying to get people's questions answered first.
It's been, I just will quote from the presentation, planning to have Finch Drive as an arterial route. How fixed is that notion? In the materials in connection with this package, there's a suggestion that Robin is an option from the engineering geotech consultant, and also in the public input package there's a suggestion maybe we should be thinking about Centennial Way, bringing an arterial route from Valleycliff over to Centennial Way. So how fixed is that notion that we're going to go for the Finch Drive option for that future access road?
I can speak to it through the chair, Dave Merrill, Director of Major Projects. It's not an absolute. That's how it's represented in the OCP conceptually. It does make sense from a sort of further connectivity as Finch Drive extends to the highway. So that would make sense to limit tour movements for people making that connection to the highway or beyond to Government Road. So it's really going to come down to how this sub-area plan, the land use orients itself relative to those roads, as well as how that future potential connection to Valleycliff comes through, what route it ends up taking.
In the terms of reference, there's reference to heritage assets. Terms of reference, that is, for the neighborhood plan. I'd like to suggest that should be considered more broadly as a layer. We don't see heritage assets in terms of old buildings here, but there are heritage layers. One of them is the history of ecological restoration projects in this area. And as Carolyn Sheekin will be well familiar with, the Mamcorm Reunion Project, which is now 15 years since it started, is part of the history of that area, and one that should be highlighted, and one that it's a layer that could be captured if we take seriously this kind of heritage lens for a particular neighborhood. And there may be other things that would come up. So heritage might be discovery as well as identifying obvious assets, in which, in this case, there may not be. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pango.
Just trying to, I take it this was a rather open, what do you want here, as opposed to, hey, we're trying to reduce the amount of infrastructure per new resident and we really like to get people out of cars. So what would you like such that, you know, if you moved here, you wouldn't want a car? We didn't sort of frame it in any way. This was and do we have any plans, assuming that's true, in the upcoming consultations to put some of that framing around commentary or the questions?
Well, it was, as you say, really open-ended, this very first kind of round of public consultation. You know, the active transportation policies in the district OCP are really what we work with. I don't know, Eunice, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, I think we're always looking with new development to improve those active transportation components. That's kind of a fixed, that's almost a given now with new projects.
Yeah, I think the first set of consultation was very broad, and when we come back with options or one option to the public, there will be more context around, why we're proposing this.
We're still some ways away from kind of getting down to those finer details. I think we have to make some basic decisions on land use, and then some of those other parts will follow, So I think that's the first hurdle we're trying to get through is, where do we think we're going in terms of land use? And a number of other things will come from that.
Do you have a follow-up?
I'll come back in commentary, maybe.
Okay, I have some questions, and then I'll go back to Councillor Herford. So how far out is this neighborhood plan looking? What's the date we said to people? This planning exercise will looks out to, is it 2040 aligned with our OCP? Is it longer than that?
It is ultimately looking, because we're looking at a much smaller area now than we initially envisioned, it is looking, at the ultimate development of those lands if there's any possibility. So that would be in line with our OCP of 2040 of what's happening inside the growth management boundary.
Okay. And then in terms of building on Councillor Pettingill's question, if we need to be carbon neutral by 2050, why isn't that the leading conversation then for any neighborhood planning that we're doing around, by 2050, each neighborhood has to support its own carbon neutrality. And so that means transit, that means walkability, that means access to services without getting in your car. And if we're not, so are we setting that context for people as we're entering into these conversations? And I think that was the question that Councillor Pettingill was driving at, because that is driving our policy work right now, is 50% by 2030, 0 carbon by 2050. So if that's not leading this conversation, what is?
We did have a backgrounder when we went to the public, but I would say that carbon neutrality is a quickly evolving priority for us. So I don't believe that was, the engagement, the first phase of engagement happened last year, and I think, if we were doing it now, we probably would have put it much more as a priority, and we will do when we go
October
back.
was after July.
Yes.
So it's something that this council, I think, is going to take a very close look at as we go forward. The other piece that is troubling me, because it's still up in the air, is the Finch Drive as the arterial road. And I get it because it connects to the highway, but also it splits this neighborhood right in two. And if you were going to plan a neighborhood, you wouldn't necessarily shove an arterial road right down the middle of it. And so how do we get closer to that in the short term of understanding that, or the feasibility of connecting up to Centennial Way? And then I look at all the sensitive habitat where that potential road would come down through, like that lower swamp area, and then it could potentially cut some of those environmentally sensitive areas that we don't actually want to touch with development, with a road. So how are staff sort of contemplating what is good planning practice about where you position arterial roads if you were planning a neighborhood at this stage in its growth?
I'll speak to that briefly. So it is really something that is a challenge for the sub-area plan, because ultimately we likely won't know what alignment that road will take until after this plan is finalized. So we're going to have to build in some flexibility to be able to locate that road where it makes sense for, we can look at the pieces that are known now, like the environmental habitat value, the steep slopes. Those are all conditions that we can assess and determine which route is feasible or more preferred. We can look at it from a planning lens as well. technically it makes sense to put it down Finch for the connectivity, maybe planning wise it makes more sense to keep it on the periphery of the area as you mentioned, so that there's not a divide in the middle. Those are the things that will be considered as part of the sub-area plan, but it's sort of the lands beyond that we don't know where that future alignment will end up going, and it's somewhat out of our control at this point. So it is going to be a challenge. We'll definitely look at the knowns and assess where the best place would be for it, but we probably also need to keep sort of an open eye as to where it might end up going in the future.
Okay, one more question, and then I'll come over to you, Councillor.
If I could just add to what Dave
Yeah.
said, because it has been a big topic for us. I think one thing is that we're working on is what does arterial road look like in the future, and does it look the same as what we do now? Probably not, especially because of the environmental constraints further east of this neighborhood. If it's going to be a connector road, it certainly there's no room for a huge road, and what we're trying to do here is slow people down on these connector roads. So I think our expectation is that this is not going to be your standard connector.
Okay. In looking at the feedback from the community and looking at some of the notes in the staff report, there's this sense of wanting to preserve the ruralness feel of this area. And then we talk about the existing drainage issues and trying to accommodate natural assets. And then we say, but we're going to curb, gutter, and sidewalk the area. And so, and put streetlights in. And so those two things sit in opposition in my mind a little bit, in that we want to preserve the rural feel. So how do we create ways for people to move around safely on bikes or on foot? And can we use natural assets rather than curb, gutter, and sidewalk, and create a different type of mobility if we're trying to preserve that rural feel? So I guess it's like, do we have to go in that direction for the whole thing?
Well, if I could just add some thoughts in here too. Yeah, I think Jonas alluded to this, that we mentioned this as an arterial road, but it may not be the typical arterial road. We're not talking about a highway, we're just looking at a road that carries a connection, and in terms of how that might look in a rural setting, or something that is an alternative type road, having a separate pathway. You need to provide your 2 lanes for cars, but you don't have to necessarily have curb, gutter, sidewalk. You can have a separate pathway that serves pedestrians and or bicycles. Those would be much lower impact ways of achieving that connectivity. But back to your earlier point, and I guess this whole issue of where a road might go, I didn't bring the slide, which I've used in staff discussions, but when you look at the topography of this area, there is certainly an upper bench that is far less challenging than trying to connect down through these steep areas. There is an upper bench up here that might prove to be a better connection to Centennial Way. Unfortunately, it's somewhat outside the scope of it's very much outside the scope of this plan, and it's also very much dependent on Squamish Nation planning, whether a road might go here or whether there might be opportunity to take roads down kind of below Robin Drive to serve their lands, and that's really dependent on their time frame. So what we're doing is looking at Finch Drive as a local arterial, and but I think we're going to have to be more definitive that this is not, we're not talking about a highway here. I just don't know what that looks like. Unfortunately, the traffic aspects are really pretty much broad-based and not in the scope of this work.
Thank you. Councillor Ford?
Thank you. Can you go back to option, or the options? Option 1, I guess, is there we go. So I for one would like to keep the some rural feel. I've heard that in the comments, and you've in your presentation you mentioned that there's some resistance from the property owners in this area, and I was wondering how we drew that, how we came to the conclusion that that was the box. So if we're going to have about, say, a similar amount, 14 acres as you've listed there, are those the best we decided that was the best 14 acres and that was the best shape of that. Like that's the best shape of that rectangle, not some other 14 acres that goes between Raven and Finch, or like that piece could look a little differently based on historical uses in the area or something, or how did we get to that particular 14 acres?
In an earlier option, we actually did just what you're describing and put the rural down in this area, and it has quite similar characteristics to the lands on Raven. They're about the same size and some history of use. Raven isn't as developed because well, I don't know exactly why it's not as developed as, Robin is not as developed as Raven at the top. These are movable parts. You know, there's nothing particularly unique about that group of properties other than there is some history of equestrian use there. But there's also a history of equestrian uses on each of these 3 streets. And we were just trying to find part of the reason for the area here, as Councillor Anderson was describing, there has been a history of industrial type uses. And I fully agree that a lot of these rural properties have kind of a hidden economy behind them. People living on a rural property with a big shop can have all kinds of employment going on there that's somewhat hidden from view. It doesn't necessarily have a big sign or look like your industrial park, but can be quite important employment generators. So because we know those are taking place here on Loggers Lane, it seemed like a natural fit to extend them out and to take advantage of the power line going through, because that can fit with those types of uses. But that rural, if there was a desire on council's part to have retain rural type land uses, really there are many properties that could apply to. You know, this whole area currently has that sort of designation on it. So that's a movable part, but we chose that because of the history of use and because it allowed us to expand the employment lands down in this area.
Councillor Herford, are you referring to the area adjacent to Kingfisher, sort of parallel?
Well, I was just thinking if we broke it down to just try to take, my mind goes to taking the specific properties out of it and looking at it as sort of like a percentage split. I do like this having a portion of rural, but I'm not yet sold that that's what that rectangle needs to look like. Whether that ends up being an L shape that encompasses different areas or some other configuration. I like the general concept of maintaining the usage. I was just trying to understand the factors that led to that particular box being drawn in that way. So, and like you said, these pieces are movable. I'm just curious how close we can get to everyone's accepting of the plan if that about that size box was drawn slightly differently, if there is advantages, disadvantages in the overall concept of the area and how we kind of got to that spot.
Yeah, the mixed use box essentially is a central area, and there are some light industrial uses even in this area as well. But this could shift over to sort of provide more of a buffer to existing neighborhoods on the other side. And this is fairly unencumbered land. However, that's where the kind of existing rural uses are.
And similarly, the hydro right of way, which is that shaded part there, including that in the mixed employment area, is thinking that it's parking and open yard sort of use rather than sort of aligning that with the agricultural.
Yeah, it has utility for both.
Okay.
Good. Councillor Stoner, and then we'll move on to comments.
Just on that point, you made reference in the presentation to the Squamish Valley Agricultural Plan. I'm just curious if any of the folks who were involved in that project have made comments on this and or understanding of viability for agricultural purposes on these lands other than equestrian use.
Through the chair, I spoke with Sarah McJanet, who provided me with some of the background information that was done through that agricultural plan, but we haven't communicated back with that group yet, other than through staff with Sarah McJanet, who was part of that.
Okay, so what specific comments do you want from us today in addition to whatever general comments council may wish to also provide? I suspect there's something about employment space versus residential.
The second, I think the big issue for me is whether rural has a role here, given that the OCP designates this neighborhood as residential. Is there a long-term role for rural here? And I guess as the discussion's been going around the table, one thing that's been occurring to me is that by designating part of the neighborhood rural, that almost might be kind of a phase-in thing, where lands may stay rural for a time, and then over time, once parts of the neighborhood fill in, those lands may come up again. But I think for me the bigger issue is what's that balance between residential, employment, and rural, and does rural really have a long-term role here?
Okay, so that is the most helpful feedback we can provide to you today?
Yes.
Okay. So council, make sure you touch on that balance for you in your comments around rural employment and residential, using option 1 and 2 as your backdrop, and then any other general comments you wish to provide. Do you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So just wondering if you can clarify, because we've talked about rural and agricultural, and in my mind, I tend to have a lot of overlap between those things. So can you just clarify exactly what you mean, especially when you say rural in this context versus agricultural?
We don't really have a clear definition of that, and it was one of the things we struggled with, because this is not true agricultural land in terms of crop production, but going back to the agriculture plan, most agriculture taking place in Squamish, even on ALR land, tends to be equestrian uses, forage, growing hay for the horses. There's not a lot of true agriculture going on. It doesn't mean there can't be in the future. 2-acre lots can be used quite intensively, greenhousing, that type of thing, for kind of small food production. So we've merged those together. Rural kind of encompasses all of those things. And we would like to, right now the rural zoning bylaw doesn't do anything to encourage agricultural production, and if we were to keep that use there, we would like to restructure that bylaw so it is more oriented toward food production and not kind of just fallow land waiting in a pre-development state.
I guess to add to that is one thing we don't mean by rural is rural estates. So we would be looking for rural type uses. And the Ministry of Agriculture accepts horse paddocks as an agricultural use.
Okay, so I'm going to just go around the table. Comments?
I guess for me, in both this large yellow region to the east, I have trouble thinking if I moved there that I would be able to do it without a car. And maybe I'm not fully understanding what's being proposed, but I do think we need to frame this in terms of, what do you want to see in this neighborhood such that you would want to get rid of your car if you live there? And, considering that we want to minimize the amount of infrastructure per person to keep taxes low, that's sort of something we hear over and over from people, at least the low taxes piece of it. What sort of neighborhood would you like? Because I think when we don't put those constraints, we get, a wish list that is sort of quite contrary to the other things we're trying to do. And so I think the land uses come second, and I don't think we can decide the land uses and then try and fill in the active transit pieces and so on within those land uses after the fact. I don't have a challenge with rural use, and intuitively, I do see sort of multi-use and more dense residential closer to Brennan Park and Lovers Lane and some light industrial and so on. Maybe the community has other ideas that can accomplish the same goals, but that's more my head is at.
That's
Thank you. Of the two options presented and knowing that there can be some sort of movement between the two, I quite like the general concept of option one. I think that the exact shape of the boxes here can change in some regard. Obviously not the area to the east. That seems to be pretty constrained, but the general mix I like. I do think that having some rural uses maintaining some rural uses in the area is important to the area in general. Really, I think we've heard a lot about potential agricultural uses and food security, and I think it'd be a shame to lose that altogether here. I like the increase in. I like the use of the mud zone in the light industrial. Again, some minor adjustments to which properties are in and out there, but I do like the inclusion of those three uses in there, not just a primarily residential. So but I do have flexibility to exactly where those lines are drawn, and maybe those ratios change slightly. But in general, I prefer this.
Thank you. I far prefer option one over option two. And I would like to see some rural feeling left in this area. And I'd like to see the business park brought to closer capacity before we start emphasizing industrial uses in this area. And I can envision more dense development along Loggers Lane between Raven and Robin. And I wouldn't want to see too much density farther to the east where that rural feeling currently exists. I don't think that there's high agricultural value in this area from a food and crop perspective, but certainly horses, goats, wild animals, chickens, I definitely see that use continued in this area.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks. Councilor Stoner?
Thank you. Through the chair, I think for me the biggest piece looking at this is, and the guiding principles that you put up is first and foremost how we maintain that natural capital as the most important value here. And in both the options, I see very large pieces of proposed development over top of creeks. And I understand that as we get into the nitty-gritty detail, we can put setbacks in, but I'm still having a hard time understanding what impact that has in terms of connectivity between those areas, and maybe this will help me if I look at it for a little bit longer, if I read Cascade Environmental Impact or Cascade Environment's report. But I think for me that's the biggest thing that I see in this area, knowing kind of the environmental history of it and the environmentally sensitive areas that it contains. Second to that, without the actual employment lands strategy or report in hand, I will appreciate what you shared in terms of the primary results of it, but without that and understanding what the trade-offs are, it's really hard for me to say that we should definitely move ahead with light industrial and mixed-use development. I think some of that space should be in there, but what that actually looks like will need to be informed by the employment land strategy. And in terms of encouraging rural, I am supportive of that, but I do think we need to do a little bit more due diligence on what that could look like. So it might not just be production, it could also be processing and manufacturing. That's one of the key components that is often lacking in our supply chain through the corridor for local food production, is also having space for processing and manufacturing. And so is that something that we integrate into that rural agricultural use? I think are questions that I still have. I don't know if that entirely helps with direction, but those are things that I would need more information on before I make a decision.
You, Councillor Anderson?
I think the role of rural in the future will always involve here our riparian zones and habitat protection zones in this area. Will give it some connotation. It's a significant portion of this district. A couple of examples. In option 1, 1020 Finch Drive is scheduled in as potential mud zone. However, the owner is adamant they want to continue farming. Whereas in option 2, we have a property that has become a de facto deer and elk winter range, and the property owner is fine with that and doesn't want to go with the option 2 housing, and laments the fact that we have lost so much of that winter range to the north. We should have started earlier with these neighborhood plans, and that has been observed by several in the public input, that the area to the north could have incorporated more rural and habitat and green space. Finally, the mixed-use development, if we implement that, that will also continue to lend the neighborhood a distinctive character, inevitably. And some of that mixed-use development, that light manufactured processing, could involve food processing as well. As Councillor Stoner's mentioned, I'd be looking forward to how we integrate information from the Employment Lands Review with this neighborhood plan.
Councillor Pettengill, did you have one more thing?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, based on some of my colleagues' comments, when I said rural and my support for that, part of what's in my mind is that would be done in such a way as to protect a larger contiguous space of, some conservation of this area. And, there may be some areas that are appropriate for some sort of more intensive agricultural, food processing type of thing. And to me, that's closer to Loggers Lane. But I really see the rural piece as a conservation thing in my mind, to at least some degree.
Okay, thanks everyone. I do like option 1. I think the balance of employment to residential will be based on what comes out in Kate's report. So how much of this land should be employment, I think, will be dictated by that study and from my perspective. I do want to preserve a sense of this ruralness. We know from our climate adaptation plan, which we had done a few years ago, that food security is something we need to look at in the long term. And so trying to preserve some of the land in this area with the input of our Food Policy Council, I think would be helpful in the short term. And we may find over time that can evolve and we can shift that in the future. But I think in the short term, whether it's that across the top or some different shape, I think makes sense to me. I think what I'm learning from this process is that I would prefer if we were calling this a neighborhood plan, not a sub-area plan, because I think overall what's been lost for me is the human element in this. This is about land use planning, but not about creating a neighborhood. And maybe the difference is subtle, but I would want, going into our second open house, that this talks more about how people would benefit from living in this neighborhood. I mean, this is, like Councillor Stoner, I think the natural assets in this area should lead and should sort of help distinguish this neighborhood. I think the infrastructure we consider putting in here should be based on best practices around natural asset management and preserving what nature is already doing for us here, which is why my earlier comments about, do we have to sidewalk and gutter everything? Or can we create a neighborhood with a more rural feel by doing off-road pathways, by doing connectivity differently? So as we go into this next open house, I would like to have more of a description of this neighborhood that's not just around land use planning, but people in this neighborhood would benefit from close proximity to high value habitat. People in this neighborhood can be closely connected to downtown and therefore consider less vehicle use. By 2050, this neighborhood has to be carbon neutral, so it should have good access to transit and bike pathways and connectivity to the north and south. So I almost want the next open house to create some context for people. It would be great if we had some concept drawings in there, but maybe that's going too far, and that's something we can consider for our next neighborhood planning process. But I want to somehow put people back into this discussion, and I know this has been done because we had development pressure, and no disparaging comments to all the developers in the room that have driven us here, but yeah, I'd rather put our community at the focus of the next one and how they feel like they want to live in this neighborhood, because we do have to increase density here. And that, I take the comments, some people don't want us to do that, and we're going to, because this is close to downtown and it makes a lot of sense. So, but, you know, with those sort of guiding principles, how do people see themselves living in the neighborhood? The things that should be front of mind for me are things that we struggle with right now, like safe routes to school and transit access, which we're trying to put into neighborhoods we've already established, but we have an opportunity here to think of this right from the start. And active transportation, all that sort of thing. And I think trying to give people a better sense of that Finch Avenue. I think everyone's imagining like 4-lane road and quite high speeds. So I think if staff can somehow go into the next open house really trying to explain that a little bit differently, or what potentially the other options are. That's the part that concerns me, is that we'll actually divide this community in half in a way that maybe isn't in its best interest, but I understand all the limiting factors of being able to decide where this road would go, since we're don't have control over those other areas to the north and south. Our climate action plan is coming out next week, and so I think the next open house kind of has to be informed by that as well. Does that help? Did you get some clarity?
We've got a lot to think about. But I've got direction on a few things, and we're going to have to go back to the drawing board.
I think generally there's consensus around option one, how those pieces lay out.
Yeah, there's more mix, and I think that, you know, I think we have got a lot of good information today, and respecting the riparian areas is kind of a backbone to me of whatever direction this plan takes. That's a kind of a foundation, and maybe we need to express that more clearly, but there seems to be good support for our mix of uses too, so that's a good message.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing too is just making sure we don't lose sight of that Fortis pipeline on some of the sensitive area mapping. That wouldn't be a bad thing to add to some of those riparian area maps that Cascade did, because that corridor is sort of defined in their EA application, and it's helpful for people to see where that would end up currently, and for council. Councilor Bird.
Thank you. I think this image actually was a bit challenging for me, where the it set aside those other layers that you clearly presented earlier. So
yes.
If this image, if we could have another one that showed, you know, option one with this,
Yes.
Even on a satellite or something, that would give you an idea of how much green would be there, even under maximum coverage of the lots and that sort of thing. I think that. But I think that Councillor Summers sort of highlighted that. I see the development over the creeks, but I don't, you know, it's hard to sort of envision that. So this is yeah, some sort of layout that included
This is really the foundation, and I think those other maps kind of misrepresent how much development area there is.
Yeah.
So we'll try and blend these. I separated them out just so I could express things more clearly, but in the end it's going to look...
I also love maps, so I always ask for like more maps or more, another layer
Yeah,
or
well,
something,
we can
so
do that.
that's fine, but I think that's a bit of context that was missing
Yeah.
overall.
I think we can now start working on refining the option one and layering everything on it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Council will take a 5-minute recess. Okay, we're back in our special business meeting. We're a little bit behind. Lower Mainland Local Government Association motions. So, we have a few that have come forward from our committee of the whole. So why don't we, I think some of them have been approved. Which ones haven't been approved?
All the ones in the white paper have been approved. All the ones in the blue paper have not.
Okay. So are there any last minute amendments or changes that people want to make to the ones on the white paper? Or are they good to stand as is? We're good? Okay.
Well,
Yep, Councillor Stoner.
I'll just provide a report back that we did bring the fair access to funding for regional public transit to the SLRD meeting, and that got unanimous support at that table. So we'll submit it as a joint resolution between Squamish and the SLRD.
Yeah, that was good. So that one will go from both of us. Yes, Councillor?
The advice is to keep the titles of these things short, and so I would be open to retitling mine Practical Measures for Resource Roads. Just drop the natural just for brevity.
Okay. Did you catch that? Thank you. Okay, so if there's no other changes on that, we're gonna go till 3 o'clock, and then if we don't get them all done, we'll have to convene after the regular business meeting, because I want to get through the business on the closed agenda before this evening. And I just realized in the back of my mind I have another one that I was supposed to write over the weekend, and so I'm going to craft that while you're speaking, Councillor Petgill. So I think all the ones on the blue sheet are from Councillor Petgill. And do they reflect your... So like the background isn't going to go to LMLGA, just the resolution.
That's fine.
Okay. I've got it. All right, so I will turn it over to you, Councillor Pettingill.
And I'll just start after talking with Ms. Klassen earlier today. I'm pulling for this year the property tax emissions one
Okay.
with John Watton. And I think for me, just sort of at a high level, the Sustainable Development Goals one, I think stands out a little bit and is one that I'm a little bit biased towards because it speaks to, whereas the other ones are very tactical about specific pieces of legislation that need to be changed and are very focused on specific emissions related things. The Sustainable Goals gets at some bigger topics which are also important, I think, in terms of equity and resilience and a few other things. So maybe if we can start, if there's any feedback on that one, start there.
People have feedback? Yep, Councillor Stoner.
I appreciate the intent behind this one, and I think, if anything, it will be a good conversation on the floor of UBCM. I think the first, therefore, it be resolved that all levels of government should be required to establish a new form of annual reporting is going to get a lot of pushback.
I have a solution to that.
Right. And one thing that I was going to propose is perhaps looking at how we could extend the carrot reporting to include components of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So at least it's all, we're proposing it as something that, adding it to an existing framework that seems familiar to folks. And I present that as an option, as something that has also been considered at the Lower Mainland LGA executive, as we've been thinking through some resolutions, and perhaps we might be coming forward with one that would try to extend the carrot reporting into green spaces and natural assets. So that is a proposal or something to think about how we can make that a little bit more palatable, perhaps.
Anybody else have feedback on this one? one of the things that local government already does is publish an annual report. And so you could say require as part of their annual report, provide a progress report on achieving the sustainable development goals.
I mean, that makes.
Or the CAREP report, like I think that's the thing is trying to use an existing framework that we already have to do. The reason this one makes sense to us is that even the Community Foundations of Canada is looking at how to incorporate the UN sustainability goals into reporting and encouraging their members to do that. And that's certainly the direction I'd like to see our OCP reporting take, is that we're reporting our measures in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I am supportive of this, but like, what's the change? What would the province need to? So the province would, the ask is therefore be involved that the province require. So not that all levels of government should be required. Like, we have to get the province to make us do this, right? That the province require all local governments to report against progress in achieving each sustainability goals in their CAREP or annual report at the discretion of the province. I don't know. And I don't have a problem with the second one, although UBCM might. But
So I would take my colleagues' guidance on whether the CAREP report or the annual report is the better option for this. And for me, it is, the intent was to have this very low barrier, and so, you know, for some municipalities, it may be a one-pager the first time through, but it's to start that thinking, and then through UBCM, possibly in the province, get something in the future a little more robust. But so the intent is not for this to be burdensome. So anywhere this fits best is, I think, a win.
I think through the annual report, it's a good place to start, as opposed to overcomplicating the CAREP report with 17 sustainable development goals.
So then I might suggest, therefore, be it resolved that the province require all levels of municipal government.
just say local government, because then that helps the regional districts out.
Okay. All levels of local government,
No, just all local government.
all local governments, to include their efforts and progress in achieving each of the sustainable development goals in their annual report.
And then I would suggest on the second, and therefore be it resolved, that the UBCM Executive form a committee to work with the province to develop a standardized reporting approach for the sustainable development goals at the local government level. So you can take out a whole bunch of that word. Like, you can take out help municipalities improve their reporting accountability over time. Just simplify it and say UBCM's best place to work with the province on what this report should look like. Right from the beginning, we would all get a cookie cutter. If it takes 2 years to get there, do you care?
No. Okay.
Okay, so now we have to read it out for Terry so that she gets it.
So, therefore, be it resolved that the province require all local government to report on their progress, efforts and progress in achieving each of the sustainable development goals in their annual report, and that UBCM work with the province to develop a standardized reporting for local government, a standard report for local government.
You can keep those last few words. Standardized reporting approach for the sustainable development goals for
Okay.
local government. Do you want to keep the form a committee part or just work or allow UBCM to figure that out?
I would let UBCM figure that
Okay.
out.
Did you get that, Terry? And do we say and be it further resolved? Or do we just,
And therefore,
the first one is therefore be it resolved, and is the second one and
Be it further resolved.
be it further resolved?
It's
Like
nice
Robin,
way to
would you
do it,
want Can we check on that, Terry?
I mean, we just put another that. So therefore be resolved that, and then and that. So the second,
Is just a that, not a resolve.
Not a further resolved.
Okay. Okay.
and
Okay, so let's vote on that one. So we want to move that we put this forward to LMLGA, moved by Councillor Peggill, seconded by Councillor Stoner. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. All right. Progress.
So just going in the order they're on the sheet, regulate sale and installation of fossil fuel systems. And this speaks to our ability as municipalities, given the significant impacts of, we've heard about even if you have a step 5 building, if you have fossil fuel heating for your water or air, you can still have very significant emissions. So it's asking for municipalities to have the tools to start dealing with this, not just for new building, but for existing building.
Councillor Peggill, do you know which legislation, is this the community charter? Ms. Arthurs, do you know? In some of these climate ones where we're asking for the power, is it the community charter?
I'm not sure, I'd have to research this.
And to be honest, I was following a pattern that was used in North Vancouver for some of their similar
Okay.
resolutions that we were working on.
All right.
So, rather than specifically identifying particular divisions and so on in legislation.
Okay. Any comments on this one? Yep, Councillor Herford.
I like the intent of this. I just think that it opens up with the sale, rental, and installation of fossil fuel. I can't just say infrastructure, because heating and hot water systems, we had one the other day that was, oh, we're only doing the stoves on it. So I wanted to say just the installation of the new infrastructure. Is that specific?
So what would it read, Councillor Herford?
So regulate the sale, rental, and installation of fossil fuel infrastructure in new and existing buildings. Because the heating, hot water systems are two of the major ones, but there's also people cooking, I don't know, whatever else, decorative fireplace, I don't know.
Does that change the intent of your resolution, Councillor Peggill?
I would say it is a
In
positive.
both spots, yeah, and sorry, and if that also happens in the whereas.
Yeah, we are speaking specifically about heating, cooling, and water heating. It doesn't refer to cooking.
Just I would, my edit would be in the whereas and the therefore as well, with the heating and hot water system, just fossil fuel, just infrastructure into the building. Cooking, stuff.
I mean, I think it makes sense to me. In the research I did, I didn't get a breakdown of this much is from cooking versus heating and so on. It just sort of talked about fossil fuel infrastructure essentially in buildings, and the assumption is that much of that is heating, but I don't know the actual breakdown.
So infrastructure or servicing or
Yeah, I think heating and hot water systems, replacing that with fossil fuel infrastructure in the whereas and the therefore.
Yeah.
Sounds.
I think your whereas should be more descriptive, and then you could tighten it up in the therefore clause, but I think people are going to need assistance in knowing what you mean by fossil fuel infrastructure. I'd actually leave the rely on gas or oil for air and water heating, cooking, and as a consequence have high GHG emission footprints. And then-
Despite their energy rating or something like that, because I think that was a learning point for me with the high levels, like a step code, we think we're doing, we're all the way there, but that whole was really enlightening for me, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
So if we then add cooking before heating in both the whereas and the resolved. So cooking, heating, and hot water systems. Is that sufficient? Because I think this leaves it open for municipalities to deal with the specific emissions ratings of these systems. Or do you think we do need to add reference to the step code? I know Port Moody does have a resolution going forward to tie in emissions to the step code, or add emissions to the step code.
I think one, sorry.
I think that's why I have a hard time wrapping my head around this, is that I think it's not, to me, pushing for inclusion of emissions in the step code is a more comprehensive way of trying to get at this than asking for powers to regulate the sale installation of fossil fuel systems. Like, I feel like we're getting really detailed with that specific ask when we know that there's already a resolution going forward on including emissions in the step code, which I think is a more comprehensive way to address this issue.
One of the things to keep in mind, though, is that if my hot water system breaks down, I can replace it with anything. So in a new home, if you include energy efficiency in the step code, that can get taken care of. But all the existing buildings, and I think that's what this resolution is trying to do, is that in the retrofit world, or if my hot water heater breaks down, that municipalities should have the ability to say, now you got to put in a heat pump. And that's a power we don't have. Or in the short term to require it. Is that right, Councillor Peggill?
I think so, and I think, bigger picture, and I've mentioned it before, the outcome of a number of these is the province may say, like, it's a whole lot of specific asks. We're going to take a step back and put together a more aggressive provincial plan, which is still a win. So I think these are, in and of themselves, good asks, but even if the province says, well, it's too specific or so on, there's still value in making that request, I think.
Yep.
On that tactic, I think I see it to some degree, but also we made it through half of the resolutions that came forward to BCM last year. And so the other part of that is the efficacy of that tactic, even if they aren't going to get addressed. But I don't think we need to debate that here.
Okay. So what's this reading as right now? I think the title is Regulate Sale and Installation of Fossil Fuel Infrastructure. Is that right? Is that a proposed amendment?
Sure, yeah. And then I think it's just in the whereas and the resolved, add cooking, comma, before heating. So rental and installation of cooking, comma, heating and hot water systems.
Another clarifying point, is this residential, is this like residential infrastructure only? No.
No.
piece of wording that you could consider on this is, and whereas many existing new buildings rely on gas or oil for air and water heating, and as a consequence rely on gas or oil for cooking, air and water heating, and as a consequence have high GHG emissions footprints, even at step 5 of the energy step code.
I had regardless of the energy efficiency was my.
Yeah. But just to like ram the point home,
Yep.
which we know from our climate leadership team. And the only other thing to consider is whether we use very high or high, as not to use hyperbole. So instead of very high GHG, it's just high.
Yeah, that's fair. So, whereas many new and existing buildings rely on gas or oil for cooking, air, and water heating, and as a consequence have high GHG emissions footprints, regardless of the building's energy efficiency, currently municipalities are restricted in their ability to regulate the sale, rental, and installation of cooking, heating, and hot water systems in new and existing buildings.
Great.
Wonderful round sentence.
That's what the whereas clause is for. And then in the therefore clause, it's regulate the sale, rental, and installation of fossil fuel heating,
Fossil fuel cooking,
heating.
and hot water systems in new and existing buildings.
Did you get all those changes? Thank you. Fabulous minute taker. Do you want to move that then?
Can I
Oh, yeah.
do one more thing into the mix?
Sure.
I'm not a big fan of ampersands and would rather see the word and spelled out. And not a big fan of acronyms, would like to see greenhouse gases spelled out.
Very good. Okay, with that. Do you want to move that?
Yeah, sure.
Moved by Councillor Pagel, seconded by Councillor Herford. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Councillor Pagel, I believe you're on a roll today.
So the next one is a PACE program, and basically this just provides, it helps municipalities help secure funding, but still it's third-party funding for citizens to do clean energy and efficiency retrofits to buildings. So it deals with the whole issue of, we've got this giant stock of old, inefficient buildings. How do we help people fix those? And Alberta, surprisingly to some, is really a bit of a leadership role on this, and so this borrows from their work.
Any feedback, thoughts, suggested changes? Councillor French?
There's another ampersand in the first whereas that I'd like to.
Strike.
And I like that PACE is spelled out, and then in brackets, the acronym. Perfect.
Perfect. Yeah, Councillor Stoner.
I just add in the therefore be it resolved clause, develop a pay-as-you-save energy retrofit incentive program. Just to remind folks that
That's what we're trying to do.
add energy retrofit in the therefore be it resolved clause.
A pay as you save energy retrofit. Yeah, Councillor Herford.
Is it important that we specifically want the PACE legislation, or could it be more similar, or does that soften it at all? Or we just want to push sharply in the one spot? I agree with the goal, but just curious.
Yeah,
Maybe a different acronym.
I think my assumption here is that the province will take any of this and put their own spin on it. So, you know, if we want to explicitly give them that permission, I think they're going to do it anyways. But.
All right. Yeah, Councillor French and then Councillor Anderson.
I don't think there are any other programs out there like this. Maybe you've done more research into it, but I think it's quite unique.
Yeah, my understanding is they are doing it in Alberta.
And I think Ontario piloted it as well. Councillor Anderson?
I wonder whether it's common that there may be a footnote link to this program. Is that? I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I see that in BCM resolutions. A footnote, web link.
Usually the comments underneath are actually by the resolutions committee, not so much by the municipality that put it forward.
PACE Alberta, sort of all one word, is an organization, so I was hoping that would get us far enough to know who we're speaking about.
Any other points? Okay. Have you got all the changes on that one, Councillor Pegler?
So I'll move that one.
Second.
Seconded by Councillor French. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries. Okay. We got 8 more minutes.
So the next one, to be honest, and I got some of these ideas from some colleagues, but I had a hard time with this at first until I really started digging into where this idea of labeling and grading homes. So they're doing it in the UK and Australia, testing it in different markets in the States. And it's kind of like an Energy Star rating on a stove or an appliance and so on. And it's just that extra little piece. So when you're selling your home, it's just that extra little thing you can do. So it's meant to be, again, just one more tool to provide people with incentives to upgrade their homes and help make them more fuel efficient.
One of the questions I had on this one, Councillor Pettengill, is whether we want that power or whether we want the province to enact this legislation and make it part of the STEP code. Because as part of the STEP code, you have to get your home blower tested, and there's, as you go up a level. And then once you do that, then you slap a sticker on the home, and whether that is better to stay with the province than bring it down to a local level. So that was one question I had.
I think that's for comment. One thing I don't want to lose, which I think kind of STEP code does, is the retrofit that we were asking for in the previous one. So if you're selling a home that has had no work done to it since it was built in the 60s, that should get a rating of whatever it is. And if you've done a bunch of work retrofit through that time, there's an advantage to seeing an increased return at time of sale and that sort of thing. So I want to make sure we don't lose that. Although I think both aspects are important. The energy efficiency labeling, I think, is actually could be really good.
Go ahead.
Just to your point, I mean, it was one of the things that with all of these, I was asking myself, well, should municipalities be doing these each individually at their own pace, or should we do it provincially? And I think just from my experience at UBCM, there are communities in BC that seem to have opposition to this sort of thing. And so I saw putting it under municipal control as giving, every municipality can proceed at their own pace, hopefully find more support for these things, and thinking that the municipalities that would want to use this would make up the majority of BC's population-wise, and a significant amount of BC's housing stocks would be worthwhile. The end goal, and I think the ideal, is that we do this province-wide, but in terms of strategically how do we get this done, I saw this as a worthwhile tactic.
Do the standards exist?
There are, each jurisdiction, so the UK has one. Different states in the US each have their own, from what I gather. There's region. It's a 5-letter acronym they've got in the States. Australia has a national standard, I believe. So there are standards. Actually, Canada has Energuide federally, but it's not required. For housing even.
Councillor Anderson?
Energuide labeling is extensively used in the real estate industry. Our local Energuide homes, they are marketed as such, and it is an important factor. But this is sort of in the private voluntary mode.
Councillor Stoner?
I personally see this as something that should sit in the private industry, as most marketing and labeling programs do. And that the policy incentives or tools that we have either at the local government or at the provincial government should be around regulation and stuff. So I'm not in favor of the labeling scheme.
Okay. I'm hearing pro, I'm hearing no. Based on the feedback, do you want to make any changes to this one, or you just want to test it out?
Yeah, I'll move it and see what happens.
Okay.
So I'll move.
Is there a seconder? I'll second it for the discussion. Councillor Grimm?
I like this one. When it gets right down to who does it and who pays for it getting done and who regulates that, that is a challenge. I mean, I think it'd be great when you look at, you know, through your potential purchases that you could actually simply rate the energy efficiency or GHG emissions of your prospective home. That makes a lot of sense to me, and those things need to be a decision point going forward. So this is obviously, these aren't meant to be fully flushed implementation plans in our, as we put forward these resolutions. So I think this scenario we can do a lot of work, and what it looks like if and when it comes out the other side might be slightly different from this. But I think it is something that should be done, and maybe as part of a new regulation in real estate transactions, it needs to have this listed as your, I don't know where the province takes that, but I'll be supporting this one. I like the end product.
Councillor French?
I take Councillor Stoner's comments, see where she's coming from, and agree with those thoughts. And then I also am thinking, let's let this go ahead and let the rest of our LMLGA friends figure out where it goes. So I'll support it with that as the background.
I don't want to support this resolution because I think the path of least resistance is to incorporate this into the energy step code and require it at the provincial level. I just like the patchwork approach of this. I think if it was worded differently, I would support it.
Our previous motion was about retrofits. I think that's a key part of this, adding value to your home, not just will you live in it because you're going to recover your investment in your heat pump over X number of years, but by adding value in your home because you're going to get a better score when you go to sell your home as an energy efficient building versus doing nothing because you're going to sell it anyways. I think that's the motivator that I see versus the seller.
Okay. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Councillor Stoner and Mayor Elliott opposed. Motion carries. Okay, that's it. We're going to cut you off there. So we'll pick these up after the regular business meeting. So we have some minutes to. Okay. Motion to close. Moved by Councillor Stoner, seconded by Councillor Anderson. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, so now we're back in our special meeting that we started this afternoon at 1 o'clock. Because this is fun. So, what we didn't do this afternoon is take all the recommended motions from the February 25th Committee of the Whole and endorse them in the special, which then allows them to go to Lower Mainland LGA. So we just need to do that. Councillor Herford?
Can you do them individually, or can I make
You
them, move them all as a group?
If you can move them all with the change that we are calling it practical measures for resource roads.
Yeah.
That was the one amendment that was made this afternoon.
Yeah, let's just try it. I'll move
Okay.
all as block.
All block with that amendment. Moved by Councillor Herford, second by Councillor Friend. Call question, all those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Okay. So people are going to get tired of us at Lower Mainland LGA. And here's Squamish for their 12th resolution. And I've lost track of where we are on the blue sheets. So Councillor Pengo, which one are we on?
The one that's labeled 10D, Clean Alternative Energy Facilitation,
Okay.
which is essentially asking the province to set up a regime so that people can start selling hydro back to BC. Hydro, again, basically it's become very, very restrictive. It's putting a real damper on micro-generation, home generation, and things that build resilience and community independence and all kinds of good community things.
Councillor, you've got this one in front of you. Do you have any comments, questions, changes? Councillor Stoner?
I wonder if we want to extend it so it's not just local governments able to sell excess power back, but other power producers.
Oh yeah, it's not just local government. Wouldn't it be business and residences and potentially local government?
It could be. I think it starts to get more complicated, especially, I think people have been feeling burnt by the IPP sort of thing a little bit, so it might be an easier path if you're able to separate out commercial operations, like if you're a homeowner, then maybe. So I wouldn't be opposed to adding homeowners to this. I'm not sure we want to go businesses as part of this resolution.
So maybe for my own clarity, is this resolution focusing on like neighborhood energy by local governments, either through wind, solar, wave, whatever they have, geothermal? Is that what you're getting at? Versus I'm an individual and I want to put solar panels on my house and it would really help if I could sell that power back to BC Hydro?
Yeah, this is a little bit more of a closer to a municipal utility, but not quite a municipal utility. But if the municipality sets a little bit of that up, that excess power, the municipality can oversee the transmission back of excess power to BC Hydro.
Is it a neighborhood utility or not? Because you're specifically saying for us to sell power back. Right now, most local governments don't generate any sort of power.
And those that do, it's not enough for them to want, from the few district utilities I do know, it's not often enough to actually want to sell power back. They're able to use, like I think of North Van or West Van, they're able to use what they're generating within their local grids.
Maybe, can we move on and I can come back to this one?
Sure.
If that's okay. So the next one is 11D, local government incentives for zero emission vehicles. And the intent of this is to give municipalities more tools to give preference to zero emission vehicles. Without requiring ministerial approval to do so.
When you say highway, we always know that highway is provincial jurisdiction. But then there are definitions in zoning bylaws that they're a little more vague, they're not specifically, is that right, Mr. Buxton? Like, there's a general term of highway that means just a road.
Yes, so it encompasses anything that's basically public right of way at the provincial level. I mean, the common language usage is the 2-lane thing, 4-lane thing that runs down the middle of the community.
I don't think we have jurisdiction over highway access.
So if we change it to road, is that?
Yeah. Did you hear me? No. Can we implement through our zoning bylaw, like parking for EV vehicles? I mean, that's already being done in the city.
Yes, there are a number of things we can do through the traffic bylaw around providing preference in various ways, but access there too is not something we can limit or restrict access to highways on that basis. That would be contained in provincial legislation, but where they can park, how long they can stop, all of those things we can do relatively easily through the traffic bylaw, but restricting people's access is not something that we can do very easily.
So if we put in paid parking downtown, we could also say that if you have an EV vehicle, skip the meter.
Yes, we could have EV lanes, as far as I'm concerned, under the traffic bylaw. But my concern is highway access, so limiting access on the basis of a vehicle in terms of you can't go on this highway at this time, or you can't go on this highway because you have a gasoline-powered vehicle. That would be far trickier and probably not possible. It's just the term access that sort of gives me a bit of reluctance here. The rest of it, in terms of we can do pretty much anything we want on our roads, not on the highway, but on our roads.
The background also starts talking about fuel efficiency studies. That's okay.
So my understanding was that we didn't have the ability to say, for example, Cleveland Avenue is now a zero emissions vehicle only road. Are you suggesting that as a municipal road we could do that now?
Well, that's a partial road closure based on vehicle type. And it's odd. I've never seen that done. You are restricting the use of that space. It's a partial road closure based on vehicle type. Never seen that done. Doesn't mean it can't be done, but
They do it in Vancouver on bicycles, like a Ontario, on bikes only.
yes, I guess the parallel is a bike lane. We do restrict the use of certain parts of our roads for bicycles, and so does Vancouver and every other municipality. So
Maybe I can go withdraw this one.
Yeah. I think for simplicity's sake, we actually should look at our climate action plan that's coming, and then if we feel like there's, because that is one of our bold moves, is to support EV infrastructure. So if we feel there's something missing after that, we can always consider another resolution. So we'll strike that one. 11B. Okay.
So now 13B is active transit incentives, and this would allow municipalities to provide different sorts of incentives to businesses facilitating active transit use by their employees. And just preemptively, I think this is meant to go beyond just things that we can mandate during zoning, but it's to provide incentives to existing businesses and people that put in showers after the fact, or give bus passes to their employees, or buy a bicycle for all their employees, that kind of thing. We may have some tools to incentivize that.
Thoughts? No thoughts on this. Everyone's brains have turned off. Staff, do you have any thoughts? It sort of speaks to business licensing, and it speaks to, when I was discussing this one with Councilor Pettengill the other day, I think our zoning bylaw for new buildings allows us to dictate end of road sort of facilities, right? Can we not ensure that there's like...
Yes, we do. No, it's in our development permit area guidelines that require end of journey facilities. So we can encourage and push. It's the tax and fee benefits that would require local government act amendments. So this one definitely is a provincial legislative change for us to be able to do this.
And through this, I think Councilor Pettengill are trying to incent existing buildings to put in these facilities. Councilor?
Oh, that was my question. If our business licensing is limited to recovering costs, and we can't really offer a discount without offsetting that, like there's a balance there, no? If we have to make them higher for because we still have costs to be covered overall, similar to our water metering or something. There's still a base cost to administer the service. So I'm just curious where the and is that where the legislation holds us back? Do you follow?
Yes, that would be
Do you follow?
under assistance to business.
Right.
So, yeah, the tax thing certainly would need a local government act amendment. Of course, the tax exemptions or tax relief are very specifically proclaimed in that legislation. So.
My concern on this one is that we still haven't discussed our climate action plan. And this one feels, as opposed to the other ones we talked about earlier today, quite far down in the weeds. And one of the things that we're trying to do through our intervention as the Supreme Court is try to establish what is a regulatory charge versus a tax, and then how does local government use that clarity around what a regulatory charge is to then apply it to business licensing and fees and charges bylaws. So in some respects, this one isn't as compelling, and if we're going to be on the floor a lot at LMLGA, I want them to be compelling, and this one I think treads on just like a nice to have, but not a must have in the early days. I don't know how others feel. I'm not feeling a lot of energy behind this one. So. Any other comments?
Well, with that point I do see it in parallel to that, to the Supreme Court case, so I'm happy to wait on this, although I think it's a crucial part, but maybe that'll establish, where authority is. We can do a more specific ask of wherever we feel there's a hole after that.
So just move it and then we can see where it goes and move on.
Okay. Councilor Anderson, no. Councilor Pettengill is moving the active trans incentives. Is there a second?
So the last one, regulated emission standards and fuel consumption standards. And this relates to the ability to regulate vehicles sold in the municipality and retail fuel sales, some of these standards. And I think for some this one may be a stretch, but I'll put that in there.
Pettengill, under this model, we could adopt different fuel and emission standards than Whistler, than Pemberton, than Vancouver. Yes? How does that benefit the province?
I think-
And then if I'm a community that doesn't have a climate action plan, I can just leave them?
I think the thought would be that communities that want to take action would use these tools and be enough of a force to push the market more quickly where it wants than where it would go on its own focus. And gives municipalities the flexibility to decide, so it's a bit easier to get support. Again, I thought this one might get a bit more pushback, but
Councillor Anderson?
The resolution as presented seems to me a little heavy-handed and a little impractical for reasons that the Mayor's touched on. But Maryland has also referred to the climate action plan that we're going to be coming back to us. And one of its elements, it concerns diesel and our fleets. Not only the district, but other GFL and industry fleets. And the proposal is that we explore what we can do to reduce emissions, to move to cleaner fuels with those fleets. Squamish terminals is another example. And it may be that as a result of that, or out of that exploration and convening representatives from those different businesses, that we may find there's some real obstacles in provincial policy. And I think that we would all be motivated then to act upon that in the form of taking it to the EBCM. So I think that, that may be only one example of an initiative that may flow out of the climate action plan as it's implemented over the next while. I would prefer to wait for that kind of background rationale for bringing a resolution addressing fuels and this sort of thing to the UBCM forum.
Any other comments on this one? I am going to draw on my experience at the Globe Conference, which several speakers said, make sure there's enough incentives in place before you bring in the stick. And also, my experience in Norway was about dialogue first and trying to find a way forward with people versus with a stick. So I agree with Councillor Anderson. I think there's a conversation that wants to happen here at the local level before I'm comfortable sending this one to the floor.
I will withdraw the stick for this year then. If I bring it back next year.
I sent Shar another resolution. So I will read it out, folks. Shar's already got this. Oh, I don't have a title yet. Let's call it efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. Someone can work on a better title. But it reads, whereas BC's transportation sector accounts for about 37% of the province's total greenhouse gas emissions, and whereas local governments are struggling to find accurate data that quantifies the transportation emissions in their municipality or region so that they can develop local action plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from this sector, therefore be it resolved that the province of BC require ICBC to collect mileage data when drivers renew their vehicle insurance and then share this data annually with local governments. Should go a long way in letting us know if we are being effective in reducing miles driven in what type of car. Ooh, maybe that's what we need to add to this, is both electric and fossil fuel vehicles. Or is that clear? If you want to know how many miles are being driven in your local government area, by vehicle type as well. And share this data by vehicle type and miles driven.
Share miles driven, share the data of miles driven by vehicle type. Share the data of miles driven by vehicle type.
Oh yeah, kilometer driven type.
And I think and fuel source, because vehicle type to a car, someone that regulates cars could very well be, it's a car, it's a minivan, it's a truck. Not explicitly calling it, we need to call it the fuel type. These are, like, there's a spot on your insurance form that says it's a gasoline vehicle, or it's a diesel vehicle, or it's a EV. So we want to make sure that we capture that we're really looking for the fuel type, and maybe the other, as granular information as we can get really from that. But
There was a conversation, I think, at the climate leadership team about trying to get better data around what people are driving. So, and I missed that meeting. So, is it about the fuel type and the kilometers driven? Or anything else?
It has actually been expressed by Chris Wickham in almost in the form of the proposed resolution, and that would be the gist of it.
Okay.
Both those elements.
Can you read the therefore statement, Shar?
Therefore, be it resolved that the province of BC require ICBC to collect mileage data when drivers renew their vehicle insurance and then share the data of kilometers driven by vehicle type annually with local governments. And I wasn't sure fuel type was.
Is it fuel type?
I think let's say both those things. To me, I don't see having more data than is
Kilometers
necessary.
driven and fuel and vehicle type. And that gives a good breakdown whether it's diesel, gasoline, EV, hydrogen, compressed natural gas. Like, there's all these
And a general reduction in trucks moving to
smaller
cars, even if they burn fuel, is still something that's worth noting. So
Yeah.
I think that both those
and
things.
a hybrid versus
Yeah.
okay. Sounds good.
I would, if we can, also like to consider adding ownership type. So is this a private vehicle? Is this an Uber? Is this what type? Like the ownership model of the vehicle? And ideally, the number of passengers, I think we're not quite there on being able to track that automatically, but the ownership piece, at least, I think is important, because I think is related to this, one of the implications of these, what are they called? The acronym, anyways, the Uber type things that
Ride hailing.
ride hailing is going to add a whole bunch of traffic with, which I think is related to the emissions piece. Is it solving and creating more emissions problems? So it's by sectors, of course, and vehicle type and fuel.
So just in response to that, if I can, in our intermunicipal business license, Vancouver is collecting data. And so we will already have through that how many cars are being used as ride-hailing vehicles within our boundaries. So we'll have a way to collect that through the intermunicipal business license process. If that helps. And I've got like hands across the board now.
Well, does that tie it though to fuel type and vehicle type, or is it a separate thing because we can't necessarily put it together?
Yeah, because you get a discount if you have like a zero emissions vehicle versus driving a fossil fuel vehicle. So I think that data is being collected that way. I'll just go this way, Councillor.
Thank you. I like this resolution, and I'm hesitant to add more layers, but having said that,
There's a layer.
yeah, I was thinking number of vehicles per address. You know, like how much info can we get and tend to share that information freely? Maybe is a way to capture it without being super prescriptive of all the different data sets that we'd like from this, because if the average household goes from, you know, feels like 5 vehicles on average down to 2, it'd be nice to track that. So I don't want to get too prescriptive in the wording, but to share as much data as they can without committing to privacy laws. Like, we'd like to know the change really though, but they already have that data and they could share it with us. So the change is the kilometers and fuel type. And more freely shared information in general.
But we would also know how many cars in total.
Mm-hmm.
So if that declines over time, is that enough?
Could do.
I don't know.
Let's not make sure, I'm just thinking what I could
Yeah,
get
yeah.
out of this.
Councilor Frank?
At the risk of making this a super complex resolution, just to speak to Councillor Penningill's point, above and beyond what we've already heard, Hyundai and Nissan are both launching car clubs. So essentially what this is a car owner, vehicle owner would pay $200 a month to Nissan, and on any given day, you could be driving any Nissan product that's your needs require on that day. And I think to capture data around that kind of vehicle ownership and car shares would also be valuable.
I would like to bring it back and keep it focused as is, at least for this year. I agree that the intermunicipal business license will give us the data that we need in terms of ride hailing, especially because those vehicles may not be registered here in our community, and the intermunicipal business license will give us data on trip starts and ends in our community and where they've started. So I think there's a component there that it'll actually give us more detailed data. You wanted to add something else? By address. I think that if we do that if we take the number of vehicles decreasing over time and you put that in our population trends and or the number of units, that would be sufficient as well. So I'm happy to keep it narrow.
I'm not too concerned about that because ICBC has that information. So it's more, to me, it's collecting the new information, and I believe they have fuel type as well. So the new information that we are asking of them, which I think is the key to this, is the kilometers driven at each renewal, which will give us information we don't have. If we want access to the number of vehicles per address or whatever other information, they have that information already. So I think we should keep this about the new information that we want them to collect.
Okay.
And then we can fight the fight of accessing the information they do have as a separate piece, if that makes sense to everybody.
Yeah, helpful. Did you ever end up, Councilor Anderson? Nope, you're good? Okay.
What's the current title?
It's lawn and board. What's the current title?
Efforts, and I might not have this exact, efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with transportation emissions.
Oh, from the transportation sector. Needs a better name. Come
Yeah.
on.
Access to ICBC. Access and improvement to ICBC data to better support.
You just made it longer.
Yeah, but it doesn't say ICBC, and to me this is an ICBC
Yeah.
ask, so it at least needs to say ICBC.
I was just gonna say like ICBC data sharing or ICBC trip data sharing, something like that.
Okay, it's getting closer. Anything from this side of the table? Come on, creative brains.
ICBC data for transportation GHG efforts.
Sure.
Catchy.
All the things. With all the marks.
I did not catch.
ICBC data for transportation GHG efforts. It's really GHG reduction efforts, but they try to get us to 4 words, and that's not easy. But the intent, if they'll let us, GHG reduction efforts.
Councilor Stoner?
We could take out transportation
Yes,
and
we can
add
now.
reduction
Yeah.
because ICBC infers transportation.
Okay.
ICBC data for GHG reduction efforts.
Super.
Yeah, I'd say strike efforts. GHG reduction. Put only efforts.
ICBC data for GHG reduction. Yeah. You need it.
Love words.
We've been resisting the acronyms. We've got GHG in there. I think everyone knows what GHG is at this point. It makes it longer and shorter. But it's also inventories. So that GHG planning, GHG like just all the work around it. It's not, and obviously we need the reduction. I think in this room we all know we need the reduction, but we can kind of,
Inventory and reduction, is that you're trying to add more?
I don't know, just information.
Okay.
I came up with an acronym, but it was really long, which we'll just, yeah.
Okay.
I'll move that.
Can we go with ICBC data for GHG reduction efforts?
Move.
Moved by Councillor Stoner, seconded by
I'll second
me.
it. Yeah.
Any further discussion? I just love you guys. I'll call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Anybody else got any more resolutions? No.
I'll ask.
I want to thank Council Tangale for coming back to this table 3 times with resolutions, and I really admire your commitment. So I thank you for that. You made us think, and there's more motions going to LMLGA thanks to you. So thank you very much. And I think that's all we have to do. So, motion to terminate.
Oh, sorry. I know we talked about these, but do you need to move that all of these ones now that Ellen?
No, because we're in the special, as we've approved them, they're
Okay.
on their way. It's just the other ones were in a committee level, so they needed to be endorsed at this table. Does that make sense? Motion to terminate. Moved by Councillor Stoner, Councillor Hertzberg. Opposed, motion carries.